Welcome to Bourbon and BS, the podcast where I dive deep into the world of spirits one shot at a time. This is Mike Fody, founder and director of the Bison Bourbon and Spirits Training Company, where my goal is to help you master spirits to guide choices on future purchases. This episode is going to be about distillation, and that can be a very complex topic, but I'm going to try to keep it simple and direct. That way, the information you pick up will help you when you're selecting your next bottle of bourbon or whiskey scotch. Some of the information may be repeated. It's done for clarity and to actually help folks learn. During the podcast, I'll review the history of distillation, how it works, what it is, the equipment that's used, and how it impacts the final product that goes into the cask for maturation. In simple terms, whiskey distillation is a process that transforms the fermented grain mash into a potent and flavorful spirit by removing water and concentrating ethanol and other congeners. The fermented mash that comes from the cooking process, or wort in the United Kingdom, is heated, causing alcohol and other aromatic vapors to separate from the water due to the different boiling points. Ethanol boils at 173 degrees Fahrenheit, while water at 212, and all those other congeners typically somewhere in between. It's far from a precise process, as it happens in stages due to various chemical boiling points. The compounds in the vapors are cooled and condensed back into a liquid, resulting in a higher alcohol concentration and congener concentration as well. What gets complicated is that they all don't boil when they hit that specific temperature. They boil in a transition. And so you can change the concentrations of various chemicals by designing or developing specific cut points in order to retain or to eliminate certain chemicals. I'm going to start with a brief history of stills from ancient fire to modern copper. It's a story of how humans learned to capture vapors, tame the fire, and bottle the flavor, and it starts a lot earlier than you might think. The story actually begins around 3500 BCE in ancient Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. Archaeologists have found vessels that look suspiciously like early distillation equipment. Back then, nobody was making booze. These devices were actually used to make perfumes and essential oils, more things related to medicine as well. Fast forward a couple thousand years to Egypt around 300 BCE. Here we find the first recognizable ancestor of the modern still. It was called an alembic still. It's a simple pot with a domed head and a tube to carry condensed vapor. Again, not for drinking, typically just for perfumes, medicines, and aromatics. But the technology was there and the spark was lit. By the first few centuries of the Common Era, Greek and Roman alchemists were refining the alembic still. They weren't distilling spirits yet, but they were getting close. And they were experimenting with alcohol as a solvent, a preservative, and a medical ingredient. These early thinkers didn't know it, but they were laying the groundwork for every pot still that would follow. The real work came in the next generation of distillers. That occurred during the 8th to the 14th centuries, during the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars like Al-Razi, names that should be talked about more in the spirits world, perfected the alembic and documented the distillation of alcohol itself. They improved temperature control, refined condensers, and created an apparatus that looks really very modern. Without their work, whiskey, brandy, and rum as we know them simply wouldn't exist. The next big leap was during medieval Europe, and we first hear the term aquavitae. By the 1100s and 1200s, knowledge from the Islamic world made its way into Europe. Monks began distilling aquavitae, or the water of life, at first, and it was medicine, a cure-all, a disinfectant, and a way to preserve herbs. But humans being humans, it didn't take long for someone to say, hey, this stuff tastes pretty good. Copper pot stills became the tool of choice. And from these humble monastic workshops and beginnings, the seeds of whiskey, brandy, and early gin began to sprout. Then, from the 1500s through the 1700s, metallurgy improved, and so did the stills. Distillers refined shapes, onion heads, lantern necks, swan arms, line arms, all in pursuit of flavor, purity, and consistency, and also using different metals. This is an era where the pot still really became iconic. The stills used for Scotch malt whiskey, Irish pot still whiskey, cognac, mezcal, they all trace their lineage to this period. Batch distillation became an art form, and cuts become a craft. And back in those days, they made their cuts purely on the master distiller's ability to taste or detect specific alcohols and congeners. Distillers learned that copper wasn't just a material, it was an ingredient. Copper is so critical to the still because it actually picks up different chemicals, particularly sulfur, that can foul the whiskey. Next comes the Industrial Revolution, and everything changes again. Around the 1800s, steam power, factories, efficiency, and two names that every distiller should know. Robert Stein in 1826, he invents the first practical column still, or continuous still, and Anus Coffey in 1831 perfects it. Suddenly, distillation doesn't have to stop between batches. You can run the still all day, every day, producing spirits at very high proofs with greater consistency and at an industrial scale. The birth of the column still, the workhorse behind vodka, gin, light rum, grain whiskey, and neutral spirits, had occurred. It doesn't replace the pot still, but it changes the game forever. Pot stills, if they're used properly, can produce the most interesting spirits because it helps retain some of the things that a column still will actually distill out. The next era came in the 20th century when specialization and increased scale occurred. As the world industrializes, so does distillation. Multi-column stills rise up, some with 5, 6, even 7 columns, and neutral spirits becomes a global commodity. But the pot still refuses to die. In fact, it becomes a badge of honor, a symbol of tradition, and a flavor maker. I loved my trip to the Springbank Distillery in Campbelltown, Scotland, because it was really there that I got to work in the distillation area and see exactly how those folks did it in the past, because the Springbank Distillery continues to do many of the things that they did 250 years ago when the distillery first opened. Two worlds emerged, one with efficiency with a column still versus one with character and the pot still. It was also continuous distillation versus batch distillation, neutral versus expressive, fast versus a little bit slower. So both have their place, and actually nowadays what happens is a lot of times there's a combination, or there's even hybrid stills that are both a pot and column still together. So as the hybrid stills became more prevalent, the craft revival occurred. If you jump to the late 20th and 21st centuries, craft distilling explodes. Small producers need flexibility, the ability to make whiskey on a Monday, gin on a Tuesday, and vodka on a Friday. Particular things like gin and vodka, which are easy to make. Once you make vodka, you can make gin. And those things don't require aging, and you can sell them while you're trying to get your whiskey to be matured. So the hybrid still really opened up new opportunities. The pot base was for character and the column plates for purity. They were modular components, and you could easily adjust reflux. Gin baskets were added, and steam jackets were added as well. It's sort of the Swiss Army knife of distillation, and it becomes the backbone of the craft movement. And today, precision, automation, and artistry have taken the distillation process to a whole new level, as well as better understanding the maturation, but we'll get to that in another podcast. But suffice it to say, today's modern distiller brings together principles that were developed hundreds of years ago with modern engineering. There are computer control systems, remote monitoring, custom copper geometries, vacuum stills for low temperature botanical extraction, massive multi-column plants producing millions of liters of neutral spirits like MGP in Indiana. And then you've got tiny craft shops that are running 250-gallon hybrid rigs with personality and soul. But at the heart of it all, the fundamentals haven't changed. It's a separation process. Heat, vapor, copper, condensation. The same dance that humans have been discovering and using and evolving for thousands of years. So the next time you're sipping a bourbon or a mezcal, cognac, just remember you're tasting history. You're tasting the evolution of human curiosity from clay pots in Mesopotamia to gleaming copper stills in Kentucky and Scotland. And that's the beauty of spirits. Every drop is a story. Now on to the process. We're going to dive a little bit into reflux and ratification. Reflux during distillation is basically when liquids are heated to form vaporized compounds, like when water turns to steam and they rise up into the still. If and when they reach a cooler area, they condense, turn back into liquid, and are collected as a distillate if they get into the collecting tank, or they fall back to be distilled again through a reheating process, which is called reflux. So when you look at the copper pot stills, particularly in Scotland, and there are some in Kentucky and in a lot of craft distilleries, as the liquid is heated, it moves up. But as it moves up, it's touching the sides of the copper pot still, which actually can cool it. And it will flow back down into the tank. But some of the chemicals that have boiled and gone up into the higher parts of the still boil at a lower or higher temperature. And so if they boil at a lower temperature, they'll get higher up into the still, and those are the ones that can end up becoming part of the final whiskey that is used for the maturation process. Ratification is closely tied to volatility. It's essential. It's basically a purification step where vaporized liquids condense back into itself. In other words, some of the chemicals that you don't want to make it into the condenser. And when they fall, the rising chemicals heat the falling ones. Some of them end up rising again, and some of them don't. And the ones that don't typically are the ones that we don't want, like the what's typically called the heads, the methanol, the butanol, the propanol. Whereas the ones that you do want, like ethanol, that keeps moving up because it's got a lower boiling point. So by returning part of the condensed vapor to the still, better separation occurs. This repeated vaporization condensation cycle enhances the quality of the final product. Just remember that we're running the still to isolate the alcohol and the desirable aromatic compounds like the congeners from the undesirable compounds. There's typically 2 and sometimes 3 runs in different types of stills. Nowadays, some people will use the first distillation or the stripping distillation to just get rid of the water and concentrate the chemicals that are left. Then the second distillation, which is usually called the spirit distillation, you'll end up getting the compounds that you want, like the ethanol and the congeners. And in some cases, particularly in Ireland, they'll run 3 distillations. The challenge with running 3 distillations is you will get a higher rectified spirit, in other words, a more purified spirit, but it also does take away some of the compounds that could be giving it flavor, and you're using a lot more energy if you run the still 3 times. Typically, craft bourbon and American whiskey typically goes through a double distillation process where a pot still and or a column still is used, but you can use 2 pot stills, you can just use a column still. It all depends on what type of product you want to produce and how much character you want it to have. But again, the first distillation is called the stripping run, and the second is called the finishing or the spirit run. Now, sometimes the stripping run is done on grain, and sometimes it's not. That just depends on the specific spirit that they are producing. I've done this in Scotland at the Springbank Distillery School and in the U.S., and each still type in each run produces completely different end products. Be careful when smelling the new make spirit or the white dog because the ABV can be very high and it can burn your nose. They usually have fruity and floral notes, the white dog, when it comes off of the still, unless it's peated, because peat changes the profile completely. A little bit more about the stripping run, where the goal is to remove unwanted components, both solids in some situations as well as chemicals. You want to quickly separate the water and alcohol and basically the water is just boiling off. But you'll also have some yeast and some grain and sediments in the boiler. Now, historically in column stills, those things would make up the stillage, which would be thrown back into the fermenter. But we'll talk about that later. The remains of the grain and any of the other solids are typically given or sold to farmers as feed for their livestock. This process involves using a very high heat applied to the wash to strip off the alcohol vapors and separate the water and the alcohol. When the product goes into the still, the ABV is around 8 to 10%. That's produced by the yeast during fermentation. But when it's finished, it's called low wines, and the ABV is somewhere in the 20 to 23% category. The stripping run typically yields about 20% of the original mash volume. So, for example, if you started with a 500-gallon wash, you could get approximately 50 to 100 gallons of low wine, depending on the way you're running the still. But there are no cuts in this run, which I'll talk about later. That's part of the finishing distillation. The finishing run takes the low wines from 4 to 5 stripping runs, which is usually 250 gallons, to be redistilled to concentrate the alcohol further up to it with pot still 70 to 80%. But some flavors are lost as well. And some flavors are concentrated. It all depends on the boiling points of those particular chemicals. U.S. whiskey regulations dictate that the final proof can be no greater than 160 for bourbon. Products that are of a higher proof would not resemble whiskey. They'd be more like vodka or a neutral grain spirit or grain alcohol. So too much distillation removes all the flavor and aromatic compounds that you need to make a good whiskey. Pot or column stills are used for these two runs depending on the product being produced and the distillery's desires. Another thing that can be done is to change the order of the stills as they're being used. So you could start with a pot still, end up with a low wines that has a lot of character, and then run it through a hybrid still or a column still to concentrate those specific congeners. You could do the opposite. You could run it through a column first. It would again be more selective in what congeners were left, and then run that in a pot still. That is really very particular to each distillery and the kind of product they want to produce. But just remember, whatever they do, they're going to keep doing because they find products that consumers want and they want to maintain that product so that they maintain their consumer base. So finishing distillation is where the cuts are made, typically by boiling points or specific gravity. That's the concentration of the alcohols and congeners and water that the distillery wants. Cuts can also be made by vapor composition. There's actually little devices that they can use to measure the specific concentration of the various chemicals. So alcohols and aromatic chemicals, again, which are called congeners, have different boiling points, so that allows the distillate to be selective in what compounds are left in there and the ones that you don't want to be left in. But just keep in mind that boiling points can also vary based on pressure, air pressure, impurities, and other factors. So distillation is a very complex process, and precise separation is important because the producer, again, wants to maintain the exact same composition as closely as possible every time they run those stills. So that brings us to cuts and what they are, which are the heads, the hearts, and the tails. And it's done by temperature. Historically, it was done by taste and smell, as well as what evolved next was hydrometers, which measured the specific gravity of the liquid. But distillation separates compounds based on volatility, and each congener has its own boiling point, and therefore appears in different proportions across the run. Cuts determine what stays in the final white dog or new make spirit and what's eliminated, because you want to get rid of the harsh solvent-like or overly heavy compounds. They're also responsible for most of the aroma and flavor, so you need to do your cuts exactly the same way. But the cuts vary by distillery, and so everybody can produce different products by cutting the heads, the hearts, and the tails at different points during the finishing or spirits distillation. And really all these aromas, again, come from the yeast strains, the grains, the fermentation temperatures. If it's hotter, things boil quicker, there's more energy, so you lose other chemicals that you might retain if you didn't boil it at such higher temperatures, or you might cause some other chemicals to run into the new make spirit that you don't want to if it's too hot. The cut widths also affect it, and then people have different house styles. They have specific textures that they want, and sometimes those textures require a little bit more of the heads or a little bit more of the tails to be included as part of the hearts. Distillation words can be very confusing because more than one word is used to describe the same thing. So you might hear somebody talk about foreshots, which is also the heads. It's the earliest, most volatile portion and typically always discarded. The heads are also called high wines, early run, or first runnings. The hearts can also be called middle cut, new make, spirit cut. And the hearts are the section of the distillation that you want to put in your casks for maturation. And then the tails, which are the end, are also called faints, low wines, late run, phenols, those kinds of things. So don't get confused. But the bottom line is the front end of it, or the foreshots, the heads, and the tails can actually be redistilled, because as I indicated before, the distillate is not pure. So if you throw what you've got from a heads cut and a tails cut back into the distillation of a new batch, you can pick up some of the ethanol that was still left. So it's important to understand that the fermentation process produces very small and safe amounts of these chemicals, but in distillation you could actually concentrate some of these chemicals that you don't want. And so that whole process has to be run very carefully, just to make sure that people don't get too much bad chemicals like methanol, which can cause poisoning. And that's something that in the 20s in the United States, they used to make the cuts very wide, or they used to add chemicals so that they could have a greater volume. But those chemicals were actually dangerous to humans. So some of the chemicals, and I'm not going to go deep into this, that are in the heads or the foreshots or the early heads, the chemicals include acetone, methanol, ethyl acetate, which can give it a fruity or solvent-like ester flavor and smell, acetaldehyde, which is associated with green apple, but it can be irritating, and some light esters as well. They can be fruity and floral. And so you may pick up a nail polish remover smell, or paint thinner, solventy, chemical burning sensation. Some of these chemicals can get bad and some can be good. Trace ethyl acetate adds a brightness and a fruity lift. Light aldehydes contribute to complexity and buffer the ethanol and the oaky flavors. So some of these things are good and some of them are not, because they're harsh, solventy, burn, and they can actually make people sick. The hearts is the next section, and that's the part that we want to retain and use for maturation. And the boiling point is around 78.2 degrees centigrade. It includes ethanol, esters, and esters have a diverse set of boiling points, I mean, they typically range in the 100 to 200 degrees centigrade area, but some of them you want, some of them you don't. And it also depends on the product that you are looking for. Aldehyde boiling points vary as well, but vanillin, which produces vanilla, has a boiling point around 285, and a lot of people associate that with bourbons. The hearts also can have some desirable esters that make it fruity and floral or honeyed. There are some higher alcohols that are okay in very low moderation because they give some texture to the spirit, like congeners, esters, and aldehydes. And then there are trace compounds that come from the heads and tails that can be useful for the complexity of the spirit. And finally, we have the tails. And the tails include terpenes, which are very diverse as well. And those boil in around 150 to 200 degrees centigrade. The fusel oils, and these include fatty acids, and they boil above 200. Phenols, they're very variable. Some of them really can add a potent aroma and flavor, and those boil in the 180 to 300 degrees centigrade. Lactones, which can be associated with coconut, they're also in that 150 to 300. Also sulfur compounds, which you have to be very careful with and remove those because they give that rotten egg kind of a aroma and taste to the spirit. So they all have varying boiling points, and you've got to make sure that you keep the ones that you want and get rid of the ones that can ruin the whiskey. Because once you ruin the whiskey, there's nothing coming back from that. You usually end up dumping it, and no one can afford to do that. And so these tails, while they can provide some interesting congeners, like furfural can give an almondy kind of a smell and taste, a lot of them are bad. They're waxy, oily, rubbery, vegetal, and they're really not desirable in the final product. Some of them actually smell like wet cardboard or damp dog, overripe or bruised fruit. And so those things you want to try to keep them out as much as possible, particularly some of the heavy esters as well. But some of them, the fatty acids, can actually add complexity and some mouthfeel. So it's an art as far as picking out what you want and what you don't want and when you make those cuts. So next I'll talk a little bit about how distillation concentrates the desirable chemicals. So don't think of distillation as just removing water and certain bad chemicals. It actually also concentrates ethanol and the flavor chemicals that you're looking for. Ethanol will be, the concentration of it will depend on the run that you make, but also the maturation process because of the angel's share, which we'll go over during the maturation podcast. Congeners with similar volatility tend to ride along with the ethanol, giving the spirit its signature flavor and character. And multiple distillations or reflux can increase the ethanol purity, but it also can strip flavor. So that's why you have to be careful. Do you want to do 2 distillations? Do you want to do 3? Do you want to have a tall column? Do you want to have a wide column? All of those factors affect the final product, and particularly copper does as well. So remember that sensory evaluation also plays a crucial role in making informed cuts during distillation, particularly in the craft distilleries and some of the distilleries in Scotland where they're not automated. They're still doing a lot of this stuff by hand. And that's a part of the real craft of distillation. And that's why it's fun to go to a place like Springbank or a craft distillery, because you can see things being done as it used to be done, even 50, 100 years ago. So now I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the anatomy of the 2 main types of stills, pot stills and column stills. And what I'd encourage you to do is to go onto the internet and see if you can find some pictures of how these stills look, how they're run, the differences between even within pot stills or column stills, how tall they are, those kinds of things, as I mentioned already, always play a role in what spirit or white dog new make spirit comes off of the still. So let's start with pot stills because that's where it pretty much started. So let's dig into pot stills first. And they have ancient origins dating back to medieval times. The monks in the Irish and Scottish monasteries refined distillation techniques and used pot stills to produce spirits that were used for medicinal and recreational purposes. The design of a pot still is pretty simple, and the parts are as follows. There's the pot or the boiler, and that's the part of the vessel where the wash or the mash is it's called in the United States, which is the fermented liquid. Typically with about an 8 to 10% ABV is heated. Now in the old pot stills that were heated by coal or peat or whatever they happened to have at the time, they had something on the inside of the pot still that was drug around the bottom by a rotator, and that was called a rummager, and it was made out of copper as well, and all that did was prevent burning of the grains as they were being moved around in the bottom of the still. The next part is the neck or the swan neck, and that's basically a pipe that goes from the pot up to the line arm or line pipe, it's called. And those two things just allow for the product to be condensed or to get to the condenser. Remember, I talked about reflux and ratification and how important those were. Well, that's where this stuff happens. So the spirits or the vapor travels up the swan neck into the line arm and ultimately goes into the condenser. But by the time that it goes into the condenser, the ABV is increased significantly because a lot of water has been removed from the liquid that has been in the pot, which is, of course, the wash or the mash. So once it travels up to the line arm, and by this time there's been a lot of reflux and ratification, it goes into the condenser. And the condenser is basically a tube. In Scotland, they use two types of condensers. There's what's called a worm tub, and the other one's a shell and tube condenser. Doesn't really matter which one you use, but what it is a copper pipe that is encased or surrounded by water, cooling water, that causes the alcohol and other congeners to condense. And that's what's collected in what's called the spirit receiver, the ABV somewhere between 20 to 22%. And it collects in this collection vessel, and then that fills up, and they usually have to make 2 or 3 mash runs or wort runs in order to be able to then run the next still, which is the spirit still. And so anything that goes into the spirit still comes from the spirit receiver. That's why it's really important to get any kind of pictures that you can off the internet to actually see what's going on. And a lot of these videos that are on the internet really show you what's going on in the still. So based on all of this, what are the characteristics of the spirit? So pot stills produce rich, flavorful spirits with unique flavors because the highest ABV they can reach typically is somewhere in the 70 to 80%. Most of the time it's closer to 70%, which is really important because there's a lot of congeners left in that spirit that comes off of the first distillation. So what you end up with is a more flavorful spirit that's going to end up going into the spirit still and being concentrated in the spirit still. So the spirit that goes into the spirit receiver retains more of the wash-derived aromas and flavors due to the lower ABV concentration developed by the reflux and ratification. So I just want to move on next a little bit to the design of pot stills and why some of them are much different. If you go to Glenmorangie, they have the tallest stills with the longest line arms and the longest swan necks. And there's a reason for that because it allows for more reflux and ratification, taking out some of the heavier congeners and other chemicals, resulting in a lighter, fruitier, and more floral kind of a whiskey. So what happens? If there's low reflux, that means there's more congeners that aren't carried into the spirit. So you would end up with a low reflux would be a shorter still. It would produce a heavier, oilier, more characterful spirit. So the shape of the swan neck and the length matters. Short neck, more heavy congeners. Long neck, like Glenmorangie, it's a cleaner spirit, less of those heavy congeners. There's also something that you'll see right after at the top of the pot, before it goes into the neck. It's called a boil ball or an onion head. And those things are added to the design of the still based on the distillery's request. And what those things do is cause more reflux and ratification. So you could have a still that was very short, but it had a big boil ball or onion head, and that would cause more reflux and ratification. And all of these parameters of the things that they put on these stills play a very important part in the final character of the spirit that's produced at that distillery. And just remember that some of the countries have legal requirements that require the spirit, for instance, cognac or Irish whiskey or single malt Scotch whiskey. It has to be distilled using a pot still. They aren't allowed to use a column still. That's dictated by law. On the other hand, the column stills emerged and they evolved in the 1830s, which is the 19th century. And of course, I mentioned that they were designed by the French, Irish, and Scottish distillers. And the goal really with these new stills, or this new type of still, was to increase efficiency, to produce higher quantities of alcohol, higher quality spirit, and a greater quantity of end product, which meant the production time was shorter. Now, one could argue if you get a very high ABV, which I mentioned before, that you're going to have many less congeners or fewer congeners, and that's not going to be as good of a spirit in a lot of people's eyes. And if you get it all above 190, it's neutral spirit. There's nothing left in there but ethanol. So the applications for the column stills are different. They're commonly used for grain whiskey production. Some producers of bourbon and American whiskeys use them as well. They're also used for Armagnac production, but the design of the column still also impacts what the final whiskey or product, whether it's Armagnac or cognac, whatever it is, how it comes out. Now, in the case of cognac, it's illegal to label something as being cognac unless it was produced in a pot still. So just some of the basics for column stills. Unlike the traditional pot still, which operates in batches, a column still works continuously, which is a huge savings because you don't have to be stopping the still and cleaning it when a batch is finished, etc. So they're much more efficient and they can run constantly. They usually do have a shutdown period where they might clean things out and make sure that no parts need to be replaced, those kinds of things. The early column stills actually consisted of two vertical columns, and they were called the analyzer and the rectifier. Current column stills can be many stories high, or they can be made up of multiple shorter columns that are connected in series or in sequence. And that just depends on what's being produced and how the distillery wants to produce it. But those really tall columns, those things are perfect for producing neutral grain spirits, basically pure ethanol. The current structure of the column still and how it functions is what I'm going to go through really quickly now. The column still typically consists of, as I said, one or two vertical towers or columns, unless it's an older one. But inside the columns are these plates or trays, and they're placed at specific distances. Now, everything I've read about column stills indicates that you need about 6 to 12 plates to capture the congeners that you want to if you're producing a whiskey. And the plates basically create little chambers within the still that act as if they were like 6 or 8 or 10, how many ever plates they are, they act like mini pot stills. So what happens is about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way up the column, the wash or the feedstock is pumped into the top of the column through a pipe. What ends up happening is that starts flowing downward, and each plate is of a specific depth. So when the plate fills, it's got a little tube in it called the downcomer that allows the wash or feedstock to flow down into the next plate. But at the same time, steam is being introduced at the bottom of the column, and the feedstock runs down through the trays due to gravity, and as it descends, the mash is heated by the rising steam, and the alcohol vapors and the congeners start evaporating and rising and interacting more and more with the steam. The higher it gets up the alcohol and the congeners get up the column, the cooler it is. So what ends up happening is condensation right in the column. And there are valves that allow them to collect different congeners and ethanols at these different plates if they want to do that. To me, it's one of the most complex things that I struggled with learning, but now I understand how it is. There's all kinds of issues around the height of the column and the diameter of the still and those kinds of things, which I don't need to go into. But what happens in the column is called fractionation. And the rising alcohol vapor encounters cooler temperature as it ascends, and then some of the alcohol condenses back into liquid form. And this process of fractionation separates the alcohol and some of the congeners from other components in the wash that they don't want. So the other components end up down at the bottom of the still, and that is what's called the setback. And that is actually what historically, and still some distilleries do, they would take the setback and put it in the next fermentation tank. Originally, they started doing that because they thought it was going to make them enable them to make more product by separating out more alcohol. But what they found it did was it caused the pH or the acidity of the next fermentation tank to go down, which killed contaminating bacteria, and so they were losing fewer batches of fermented product, and so that's why a lot of them kept using the washback. So the next thing is, the still just runs, and as long as you keep putting feedstock at the top and steam at the bottom, it will run constantly. So ultimately what it does, it's much more efficient as far as producing large volumes of whiskey consistently. It's much more energy efficient because unlike pot stills, you're not required to cool them and heat them and cool them and heat them and do it in a cycle. It just keeps running. The skill requirements, operating a column still is less labor and skill intensive than managing pot stills, and the output is higher as far as the volume and the concentration of the alcohol that's produced by a column still. Of course, it's got less character, less congeners. So column stills contribute to a wide range of whiskeys, and what some distilleries do is they produce grain whiskeys to use in blends because they're much more delicate and they're less congener laden, and they can mix those or blend those with some products that are produced in pot stills. And so bourbons and ryes, some very heavy charactered American whiskeys, also emerge from column stills, but a lot of times it's a combination or blend of column still produced product with pot still produced product. Now, as I mentioned before, with a column still, you have this breakdown or separation of the alcohols and the congeners as it moves up the still. And they pull those different congeners and the concentrated alcohol off the still wherever they feel like it to end up with what they want in their whiskey. But most whiskeys still undergo two distillations. It's either a pot still and followed by a column, or a column first followed by a pot, or maybe a hybrid still, which is basically a pot still with a column connected to the top of it. But again, the initial distillation produces a spirit known as the low wines, which is somewhere in the 20 to 22 up to 25% ABV, and it's cleaned of all the solids and stored in the low wines tank. The second distillation further concentrates the alcohol and congeners, resulting typically in a spirit that is anywhere 55 to 70% ABV for the pot stills. Now, a column still can produce much higher ABVs. And then again, you do have in Ireland, most of their whiskeys is a triple distillation, which is even more energy inefficient. They use a lot more energy. And a few of the Scottish distilleries do that. As I mentioned, I think I said Octotoshan and Springbank still has some triple distilled product. So just to sort of wrap it up, the pot still produces a rich, flavorful spirit with more congeners due to its batch process, and it retains more character from the raw materials, the grains and yeast, etc. The column still is used in large-scale production, and it yields a lighter, cleaner spirit. The continuous process allows for higher efficiency and energy and alcohol concentration up to a maximum of about 96.5% alcohol by volume, but it sacrifices the complexity. The last thing I want to mention about stills is, again, this whole idea that they use copper, and they use it for basically three reasons. The first is that it's very malleable. It can be hammered into all kinds of different shapes, and it's really fascinating to go to Vendôme or one of these other still producers and watch them. They'll let you do tours and watch them build these stills, and in Scotland they're still doing it by hand. And they basically have maps on how to make the stills for different specific distilleries, and even how to repair the stills if they start wearing down in any section of the pot or the line arm or whatever it happens to be. The second thing about the copper, and I mentioned this before as well, is that it absorbs sulfur compounds. Sulfur compounds, of course, would give it that rotten egg taste. And if you get that in your whiskey, you're not getting it out. You can mature it, you can try to do everything, but you can't pull that out. You want to get it out during production. And then the final thing about copper, it's a great conductor. So it transfers heat very efficiently, which reduces the amount of energy that it takes to produce the whiskey. So thanks for joining me on this whiskey deep dive. Whether as a beginner discovering new flavors or an aficionado pursuing perfection, the journey always has another fascinating glass to offer and story to tell. Please join me at the Buffalo Distilling Company for a deluxe tour and tasting, or even better, a whiskey workshop, by signing up on my website to experience a Buffalo-made bourbon firsthand. Special shout out to the Buffalo Distilling Company for the use of their distillery for tours, tastings, and the whiskey workshop. And again, please leave questions and comments on my website at bisonbourbonspiritstc.com. That's bisonbourbonspiritstc.com. This podcast produces general information and entertainment. Always drink responsibly and consult local regulations before imbibing. This podcast is meant for listeners who are of legal drinking age. I'll be back next time with another deep dive into whiskey. Until then, check out the blog, explore the merchandise, and join me for a workshop or a tasting at the Buffalo Distilling Company. Until the next podcast, keep sipping, keep exploring, and remember, good whiskey is like a well-crafted story. Do you love bourbon and BS? Tell a friend. We're trying to grow this thing the old way, the old-fashioned way, one honest pour and one honest listener at a time. Cheers to bold spirits and curious minds.